OSU grad.
Oh, OSU, yeah, absolutely. And Ohio native, and a Buckeye, and from the word go. Yeah. Gary, yes. Come in, Ken. Yeah. Okay, let's begin. Let's begin. It's my privilege to welcome you to the University of Tennessee Nuclear Engineering Department Colloquium Program. My name is Lee Dodds, and it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Rich Adams, who is Senior Vice President and the Chief Technology Officer for the Battelle Memorial Institute. Rich received a BS and an MS in economics in 1975 and 1977, and then a PhD in science and technology policy from George Mason University in 1995. He actually joined Battelle in 1977, and in the early 90s, they thought highly enough of him. He'd held several senior management positions, but they sent him back to the university to get a PhD at full salary. And he came back to Battelle when he got his degree in 95, and 3 years later he became the Chief Technology Officer, Senior Vice President. The title of his presentation today is Perspectives on Designing the Molecular World, a Nano-centric View. So, welcome, Rich.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I understand the way you normally do this is you wait and do questions afterwards, which is fine with me. If you want to interrupt as I'm going through, that part's fine with me too, but whatever way works best for you folks. See, it does do that, doesn't it? It was down there. I'm going to give a talk that really ranges over sort of a wide variety of things. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Battelle. My guess is that few of you know much about it. Just a little bit of introductory information so you can have a little bit of background. Next, I'm going to talk about both relevant market and science and technology trends that are particularly related to the sort of designing the molecular world topic, which is a lot of people are interested in these days. Then I'm going to go into how Battelle is approaching some of the nanoscience, nanotechnology areas that we think are particularly relevant to the design of that molecular world. And then finally, I'm going to end on approaches around partnerships and collaborations, because more and more Battelle is linking up with universities, various places, other national laboratories that we're involved in working with, to bring together a group of people to be able to accomplish things together. And as you hear my talk, you'll realize at least some of the reasons why that's important to us. So I'm going to start with just a bit of an overview on Battelle. Battelle is a non-profit 501c3, means non-tax-paying organization, and it's a charitable trust. Basically, we give at least 20% of revenue that we make or profits that we make at the end of the year that goes back to charities, largely around Central Ohio, but really in all the places where Battelle folks live and work. And we were formed in 1925. There was quite a period of time where we actually were a tax-paying charitable trust. A real strange kind of twist of events. You don't want to know more about it other than we regained our non-tax status just recently. Secondly, our principal business has been for years and years fee-for-service contract research. This is the business that many of you are in some way or another. That is selling smart labor and earning a fee on that particular labor. In fact, Battelle started contract research in many respects, going back to work that we did in the 20s and 30s. We're a company that when you put all the different sources of revenue together is approximately $3 billion a year. We have about a little over $1 billion in assets. We manage or co-manage 4 Department of Energy National Laboratory, one that's very close to you folks here that some of you or all of you work with, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which we manage with the University of Tennessee, I hope you know. We also have a set of core universities that are involved in that as well. We manage Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Brookhaven National Laboratory, and NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory as well. We have over 15,000 employees when you look across all these different laboratories. Now, some of them have different labels. So when I say 15,000, Some of them are UT Battelle employees. Some of them are just Battelle employees, but they're all related to what we think of as the family. And then there's more than 5,000 projects for over just a large number of clients involved in that particular process. These are just pictures of the different laboratories that we manage. Just a word on each of them. Brookhaven National Laboratory, properly mentioned, is principally now an accelerator laboratory. They used to have reactors there. They've all been shut down, I assume never to be started up again. Unlike at Oak Ridge, where they've maintained a reactor facility there with the restart of Heifer, as you know, and likely that will continue for some period of time. So Brookhaven is an accelerator laboratory, most principally known for two user facilities, National Synchrotron Light Source, and the most recent one, which is RHIC, Relativistic Heavy Ion Collider, which is about $1 billion project. You can see that little ring up here on the top of it, which is that when it was under construction. Point with that. Thank you. And Oak Ridge, you know about. There's Battelle Europe operations, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory over here, which is known for alternative energy sources of one type or another, mostly or principally photovoltaics, but a lot of other as well. Our headquarter laboratories, which are located in Columbus, and then finally Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is the part of the organization that I grew up in. I joined Pacific Northwest National Lab in 1977. The strategic foundation of Battelle. We basically are operating three different business lines inside Battelle. The one that we're most known for today, which is our DOE market sector, where we manage 4 national laboratories. Another one that we call the government market sector, which is basically where we do contract research with a variety of principally government, sometimes commercial market sectors. And then most recently, in the last 5 years or so, we've developed a commercial side to our business, like many have, where because we're a non-profit organization, we can take title to the intellectual property, just like the University of Tennessee can, under research, intellectual property developed by the government-funded research, and then we can move that to commercial outcomes of one type or another. So Battelle has started up 10 or so different spin-outs, for example, in the last, say, 5 years, with a diversity of spin-outs, one including a drug delivery company, a pulmonary drug delivery company that's right now in clinical trials and treating lung cancer. Might be one extreme, another extreme would be a thin films technology company that's headed toward the OLED plastic display, and lots of other things in between. And Optimer Photonics, which is a company that's all about optical switching based on electro-optical materials principles. All those are different startup companies that we've put together in the last 5 years or so. Battelle's core capabilities have always been, and I suspect always will be, development and deployment of science and technology. That's really who we are, fundamentally. And our business model, as I mentioned earlier, takes advantage of this ability as a nonprofit to take title to intellectual property developed by government funding. This is principally related to what generally is known as Bayh-Dole legislation from the late 80s. And then the ability to bring together diverse technical capabilities. When you look at the breadth and depth of science and technology capabilities inside Battelle or the laboratories that we manage, it's utterly phenomenal. And one of the challenges and opportunities that we have is to figure out how to take advantage of that and bring those different folks together so that they can create value together in the marketplace. So that's all I'm going to say about Battelle. Be glad to answer any questions if you want to get into that. Now I want to switch over to what I see, and certainly many others also see, as one of the prevailing forces that's kind of driving a lot of the interesting science and technology opportunities today. And I'm going to go through this at a relatively high level, relatively basic approach, because I want to try to make the points how I see this playing out over time and what I see as some of the opportunities, and then where in particular Battelle is focused on these. 3 of the principal forces that I think are operating today that really offer opportunities for a very different world from a science and technology standpoint are, first and foremost, the conversion of biology from a descriptive science to a quantitative science. That is, I think, based on the genome work and the proteomics-based work that is going on now, we are seeing literally a revolution where you are literally going to be able to understand cause and effect relationships from a biology standpoint rather than biology being principally an art, or at least medicine being principally an art. And those principal understandings are going to be one central force going forward. A second one is many of us believe that nanoscience and nanotechnology, which is opening up potentially new worlds of some physical realities, whether it's physical, chemical, magnetic, other kinds of properties, is going to create new kinds of forces that can be manipulated for a variety of practical purposes. And then third, and not least in this process, is the computational modeling capabilities, which are allowing us to model things that otherwise we would have had to go into laboratories in order to run experiments on. And my principal premise here is that you put these any one of them individually is a very interesting change in science and technology. You put these three forces together, and you bring people together who understand and bring to the table different capabilities around these three, and you're going to open up worlds of possibilities for the future. We're going to talk just a little bit about what I think some of those are. So what do I think this means for the future? There's a lot of different ways you can look at it, but here's at least my way of thinking about this, that future systems are going to be based on molecular design, whether it is biological materials themselves or whether it's bio-inspired materials, whatever form that takes. You're going to see molecular design based on biological principles as being a fundamental force going forward. Secondly, you're going to see initially, and we already are seeing to some extent, these molecular designs being created by top-down kinds of forces, which is the traditional materials approach, right? But over time, what we're going to see, and we already see the beginning of this to some degree, is self-assembly-based forces that we can take advantage of, that is going to create them from the bottom up. And really, in many ways, the challenge and the opportunity is to figure out how you take advantage of these biologically inspired materials and you build them from the bottom up, whether it's atom by atom or whatever form that's going to take. You build processes that allow you to do that. Now, there's lots of different things that are going on right now that demonstrate the power of this. None of it has begun to reach the potential, but at least it's demonstrating the power of this. Just a couple specific ones that a lot of people are working on today relate to quantum dot lasers. One of the principal forces that's going on right now in the materials world, in this molecular design part of the materials world, is looking at how you can basically have semiconductor-based photonic materials devices that have similar properties, but instead of using electrons, obviously you're now using photons. And to be able to control those photons in much the same way that we can control electrons today. After all, those electrons are just a little too slow, aren't they? We got to move up a few miles per hour and get into the speed of light, and think of the opportunities that those enable us to take advantage of. The best way to create these large, complex, and high-performance systems is to grow it, as I said before. Principally, it's going to be to start with a top-down process, no doubt about that. That's the only way we can do it today. But there's a lot of work that's going on right now about self-assembly and growing it from the bottom up. Again, whether it's biological materials themselves or bio-inspired materials that we're talking about. Now I want to add a dimension to this that I think is particularly important. All of that has got to be considered in the context of a certain set of market forces that I believe are relevant, that are out there operating today, and a set of science and technology forces that are also important. I've listed three here on the market forces side. This is stuff that may be foreign to some of you or different ways of thinking about things. Most of the high-value products out in the commercial marketplace today are the result of technology fusion. And what I mean by that is they're the linking together of previously existing pieces of technology in new ways that dramatically enhance the performance of the technology relative to what previously existed. Now, why this is so foreign sometimes in the United States is that most people still, to one degree or another, believe that innovation, the whole innovation process, is somehow something that comes out of often a single discipline in a particular research organization or something like that. This is a concept that says most of the high-value products out there come out of the ability to put together very diverse teams, people with very different backgrounds and knowledge, and bring them together to create these kinds of technologies and intellectual property. The second issue on the market force side is most of the laboratories that we work with are producing intellectual property and other kinds of advances that come out of the laboratory, and the researchers that are involved in developing them generally believe that they are fully ready for the commercial marketplace, right? You might have heard this before. Maybe it's even occurred at the University of Tennessee, although I doubt it, right? That what often happens, though, is there's a valley of depth between what comes out of a laboratory in one form or another and what is required in order to have commercial success. And one of the drivers in the market forces today is to figure out how you can transverse that valley of depth. You'll hear me talk a little bit more about that later. And the third is the power of disruptive technologies. Most of what Battelle is involved in, especially on the commercial side, is in creating disruptive technologies. This is sort of in the phrase has been used for more recently, was coined by Clay Christensen in this. And you guys read any of that book? Does this look familiar at all? No. So this is generally what's called radical innovations. It's more recently been disruptive technologies. These are things that create markets. They're not the incremental advancements, but they create all new markets based on producing these technologies. Higher risk, much higher returns in the marketplace if you can bring these things to market. Okay? So those are the market forces that are operating. The S&T forces that are consistent with that are all the progress that's of most interest is all about operating at the interfaces. The interfaces between different areas of science and technology, the interfaces between research and manufacturing and marketing, all the opportunities occur at the interfaces. And you have to create opportunities for those collaborations and partnerships to take place. And the other force that is particularly valuable or relevant on the S&T side is that there are very large barriers to entry in this area because it takes a lot of know-how embedded in terms of facilities, equipment, and people. So all those are some of the things that we face as we go forward. So what are some of the implications of this? As you go through, and there's a certain logic path here that I won't go through in detail, but as you go through looking at what it takes for technology fusion to occur, what you find very quickly is that you have to focus on self-organizing and adaptive systems. And when I'm describing self-organizing here as involving people, these are systems where people and science and technology are involved together. In other words, you create teams and you empower these teams to operate, and if you have the right people engaged with the right incentives, then they can build the kind of technology that you're looking for here. There's this whole issue around path dependence that comes out of this. In order to be a leader in whatever area you're talking about, in this particular area it's designing the molecular world, you have to almost literally play in it from day one going forward. It's impossible to take a break and come back in it because too much has happened during that time that you were taking a break in order to be successful. Third, you see a lot of investments today in the science and technology realm, especially in the commercial side, that are focused around platforms. You just can't afford to be the best at everything. So you have to pick certain areas where you want to invest in and develop breadth and depth in. So those are generally called platforms. And then there's adjectives in front of them, like technology platform or product platform, and they all have little different meanings. But the concept is the same, building and focusing in a specific set of areas. And then a final area here is more complex innovation systems. Sort of the old notion of a kind of the university-based model of a senior faculty member and a few grad students around him or her is not the model that is required to produce these kinds of results. The model that we see here that works best is one where you have large teams, you've got them focused on a particular outcome, you've got a fairly equal team, often in terms of expertise and relevance in a particular area, and that's the kind of team that tends to work. So those are some of the background pieces of information. Now let me say something about Battelle's strategic approach to nanotechnology. And I'm going to describe here a little bit about how we view the partnerships. When we go about deciding how it is that we're going to focus in nanotechnology, Battelle recognizes very early on that there's no way that we can do this alone. And there's really three principal things that we're engaged in working with as we go through this process. There's what we call a characterization and structure part of the process, which is really the more fundamental piece. There's a part of what we're engaged in which is to build functionality, which is more where we tend to play. And then there's a device and application piece where you're applying it to whether it's in the commercial marketplace or in the government marketplace, you're applying it to a specific set of outcomes. Now, when we partner to do this, where we're picking up universities and our national lab partners in this process is back here in the early phases of characterization and structure. These are the folks that are doing the fundamental work that we want to be able to take advantage of. And they're principally funded by the government. So some of you probably know that Oak Ridge has got a major new nanoscience center that's being formed that will probably have $30+ million a year worth of funding attached to it. Brookhaven National Laboratory has got another center that's being formed with similar kinds of funding. This is the kind of work that we want to take advantage of that falls into this characterization and structure piece. Now let me go to the other side. The other side is that we need venture capital and industrial partners to go out into the commercial marketplace with this stuff. And Patel doesn't know how to do that. I mean, we are not a manufacturing, sales, and distribution organization. So we go get partners to help us in that process. And we have a variety of folks we work with who are developing these devices and applications. Where we tend to work, as I said before, is around building functionality. And back to the comment that I gave earlier, that valley of death that describes the difference between what comes out of generally this process and what's required in order to work over here, this is where we're funding the valley of death. This is, in fact, where Patel is putting in its own money in order to build capabilities, to build intellectual property, to, again, serve both government and commercial customers in this process. So this is kind of how we think about this going forward. The arrow going up is just generally an indication of the value of whatever it is that's coming out of it to whoever the final customer might be in the process. There are 4 principal areas where we're building this functionality. They fall into the categories of new functional materials, building blocks, higher order structures, and hard and soft interfaces. These are the areas where we're focusing most of our investments. Some of the universities that we're working in right now, for example, and developing some capabilities, are particularly relevant in the new functional materials piece and the higher order structure pieces. The work that's going on to develop different kinds of photonic crystal structures, for example, how you build functionality into those, and then how you develop the processes to actually build the actual devices is some of the most interesting work that's coming out there that, again, falls into that new functional materials and the higher order structure cases. Most of all of our investments in this building functionality are focused at the interface of 2 or all 3 of these circles. That is the interface between biotechnology, nanotechnology, and photonics. All of our investments in one form or another fall into these 6 categories that are up here: bio-based materials, bio-inspired materials, biomolecular self-assembly, polymeric photonic materials, optoelectrical outputs, circuits, and photonic crystals. Those are all the areas where we're building the functionality. And if we do our job right, we're going to have very critical gatekeeping pieces of intellectual property that are going to come out of our investments in this particular space. Notice all of it, we believe, is underscored by investments and support in the computational science and this whole area that we generally just call extraordinary instruments. These are the 4 particular areas where we have the focus. Another way of looking at the focus of our investments, they fall into the areas of nanocomposites, polymer particles, macromolecules, and these hard-soft material interfaces. Generally, the nanocomposites work today is mostly still top-down in nature. This is, for example, how do you figure out how you take these carbon nanotubes and put them into different kinds of existing material structures to enhance their properties in one form or another. And it's all about controlling electrons or photons or something at the interfaces. Now, when you get into the polymer particles, into the macromolecules, you're beginning to get into the assembly to the higher order structure pieces and in the process in the building blocks. And then finally, when you're getting to hard-soft material interfaces, oftentimes some of the principal devices that we're after build on and require some of those hard-soft material interface capabilities. So that's where we're focusing our investments. Oh, one other thing. Just an illustration across the top of this, it talks about the different marketplaces that we're going after in these areas. You can see there's a telecom market. Like many folks, we believe someday that will reemerge. It has been certainly dormant for some period of time now. There's a biotechnology market, and then there's what we just call their advanced materials market, which has a lot of different ways it can go to the marketplace. Telecommunications markets generally fall into some kind of photonic bandgap technology of one type or another. The biotechnology market has a drug delivery component to it in one form and a tissue engineering orientation to it in others. And then advanced materials, as I said, can take a variety of forms.
You're going back.
Thank you.
There.
Oh, that's why.
Oh, yeah, you're sitting on it.
There you go.
Oh, what are we doing here?
Try it again.
Okay. All I did here was list these different, just describe these 4 different categories. Nanocomposites is this controlling the dispersion, this interfacial chemistry and placement of nanoparticles in these polar matrix. A variety of different things you do with this. High index optical materials is certainly one of the principal outcomes that we're after here. Another one is a lot of people are interested. Oh, there I go again. A lot of people are interested in figuring out how you go about. There's a category up there called ice-phobic materials. Imagine if you could put the right materials on an airplane wing that would somehow not require us to go through that damn de-icing process every time we get ready to go someplace recently. That would be nice. So there's a variety of different things you can do with this. The polymer particles, this is the ability, that really the whole notion here is monodispersed particles in one way or another. Whether you're going to lay down coatings or whether you're building structures with them, you want to be able to control the size of these particles very precisely and then how they form together. So that's where we're building functionality here. This photonic bandgap devices is, again, one of the key outcomes here. Macromolecules is around structure, characterization, function. This is a particular area of interest around proteins and these biomimetic materials. Controlling the assembly of these nanostructures is a key part of this. And then I mentioned earlier the hard-soft material interfaces. A lot of this has to do with the fabricating both two-dimensional and three-dimensional photonic bandgap devices, and so it also relates to scaffolding for tissue engineering. So those are just examples of some of the kinds of things we're doing with it. This is a picture that you see quite a bit, this one over here, which is an example of a 3D photonic bandgap structure where you're, as I mentioned in the early part of this, that the holy grail in some ways is to figure out how to develop semiconductor-like materials using photonic bandgap materials for photons rather than electrons. There's a lot of interesting work that many folks besides us are doing that we believe is going to be essential to capture that technology. And when you do open it up, there's a variety of different applications that come out of that. This other example that I have here is a drug targeting and delivery technology, which is all about, in this case, a polymer particle, and using those with dendrimers, and which actually allows you to both target where the particle, the drug would be delivered to in your body based on a sensor in the system, and then the actual delivery of the device over time. Controlled release process so that you could control where the drug goes and how much of it goes to different parts in your body. These are just some of the kinds of things that can be enabled in this process. So the last part of this talk goes on to Battelle approaches to partnerships and collaborations. And the only time that you can do something like this and it makes any sense is you got to sort of talk about what we're good at and what we're not good at. And then that forms generally the basis for collaborations. And this is how we think about working with universities or industrial partners or whoever it may be. So what do we generally think we're good at? Well, we have highly skilled research teams focused on finding innovative solutions. That's our whole business. We really know how to do that quite well. Long-term relationships with the Department of Energy and other R&D funding organizations. Especially if they're in the government, we know about it. As you know, a fair number of them too. Ability to rapidly draw together teams with diverse skills. One of the things that's both an advantage and a disadvantage, a positive way of thinking about it, we have no commercial product lines that we have to obsolete. before producing a new product. Did you ever notice in the United States that most of the radical innovations do not come out of the industry itself or out of the companies itself, so the current leaders in that particular technology area? Right? It took Apple for IBM to wake up and realize mainframes weren't necessarily the only thing of the future, right? And there's example after example where that's the case. And so one of our advantages, we don't have a current set of product lines that we're worrying about obsoleting by producing a new set of products that are disruptive in the marketplace. Ability, willingness to partner to gain access, and ability to access high-value intellectual property via the nonprofit status. Because we're a 501c3 again, we now have corporations that are approaching us about it, just as universities do. Sometimes corporations are approaching us around donating their intellectual property to us as a write-off. The challenge with that, though, is there's a certain amount of diligence that's required after the intellectual property gets donated. Otherwise, they don't get the write-off. So you have to be careful about it. What are our relative weaknesses? Lack of in-depth commercial market insight and knowledge. We just don't know that. We know the government world very well. We don't know the commercial world that well. We have to partner in order to gain access to it. Lack of manufacturing, sales, distribution systems, similar concept. Lack of breadth, depth of required science and technology assets, despite the array of science and technology skills that we have. We know there are critical areas where we have to go get others involved. This is principally where our university interactions come from. What I was describing earlier in some of the functional materials work and some of the higher order structures, we're working with university partners right now in some of those areas. And then the lack of financial strength to go it alone, we would want to anyway. This is not where we work with universities. Universities don't offer money. They offer a lot of other side. They offer a lot of expertise, but generally not money in the process. So that's where we partner with others for that. So all that kind of leads to a model for collaboration, which is, I think, my last slide here, that we are interested in collaborating with leading researchers and universities to develop these collaborative R&D programs with a focus targeted at these high-value commercial opportunities. That's one of the areas that we want to interact with people on. Leaders from the financial investment community and industry work with Patel and their partners to scope and align the R&D. One of the things that we do a lot of is work with venture capital folks, work with industry folks, so that we can scope and align our R&D so that it has value to them. Many of the spin-outs that I described earlier are a result of this kind of a process. Access to special facilities, product development expertise. When you go look at the extraordinary instrumentation that's generally called across these DOE laboratories in Invitel, Columbus, it's an amazing set of skills to draw in the process. And then finally, IP strategy and IP rights agreed to at project outset. One of the first things we get into in a collaboration, if it doesn't start off well, is folks start asking questions around who owns intellectual property. And we've learned you just have to work that out right up front in the process, deal with it on a case-by-case basis. There's no one rule that works in every particular case. So I tried to give you a broad overview of a variety of things that we're engaged in and be glad to answer questions.
All right. We have time for questions and comments.
Yeah.
Andrew?
A couple of months ago in Red Herring magazine, they had an article on nanotechnology, and what they were saying was that right now there's not a lot of work being done on examining the stuff, seeing, okay, if you have small nanoparticles, how do they affect health and so forth. And what they were suggesting is that the whole nanotechnology industry is headed for a train wreck because there are now groups that are saying we need to stop all kinds of nano research until we understand this stuff better.
Right.
Do you have any comments on that?
Sure. The nano craze, if you want to call it that, which started, 2 or 3 years ago or something, has some similarities to the dot-com craze in many ways. There's no revenue attached to anything yet other than R&D. There's no product. Well, there are a few. I shouldn't say no. There's some cases where there's some revenue, but it's relatively simplistic, nano-based approaches at this particular point. There's a wild swing it's one of the few areas in the investment community where folks seem to still be willing to put money into a startup. or some kind of early stage research that's going on. There's many aspects of nanoscience and nanotechnology that are entirely unknown. I mean, when I was saying, to me, this realm of looking at nanoscience could be similar to sort of Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics. There could be that level of change associated with the learning that could come out of this process. To begin to even suggest we know what that means yet, well, certainly I'm not willing to do that. Maybe Carl would, or someone who knows this field better than I do, say something more about that. But yeah, sure. I mean, Red Herring would write something like that, and I can see a group of people that have a valid interest and concern in that particular question. But at this particular point in time, it is so early to begin to describe what the implications of all this are going to be. That without saying that's necessarily wrong, I would say there's a lot of other things we have to deal with in addition to some of the implications of this from a health standpoint. Yeah.
Do you think then that the people who are militating in favor of severely regulating or this area, or almost putting it all on hold by regulations, do you think then that their efforts will largely be unsuccessful in the next few years? Because that's...
Well, I think that the R&D community has made it very, very clear that they're going to fund research in this space. This is sort of like proclaiming that we're not going to allow human cloning of any type, right? I suspect it's going to happen somewhere. The point here is that there's no doubt that the research agenda is going to go forward. My point is really what form it's going to take. Undoubtedly, there'll be, from the drug delivery standpoint, a whole array of FDA issues that will have to be addressed ultimately before an approved product is delivered to the marketplace. Safety issues, no doubt, no doubt. But look at the range of market opportunities that we're talking about out there. Some of the principal ones being photonic devices of one type or another that have telecom and other kinds of applications. There's a whole variety of ways this can go forward. The particular focus of your comment is related to one very important one around drug delivery. I have no doubt the agenda will move forward. Will there be things that get in its way as it goes forward? Absolutely. And I suspect we don't even begin to know what they are at this point. I still think the promise is there, and that's what so many folks are looking at this point. The question, I think, in part is how long will people sort of hold out hope? How long will they give it? You know, the dot-com folks lasted about, well, it was quite a long period of time, really, 3 or 4 years, and then gave up. So, and I am concerned. My biggest concern with Nano right now is it'll lose its cachet very rapidly, and funding will just disappear, mostly on the private funding side, not the government R&D side. Good question.
You talked about research programs that have the ultimate goal of product development. Do you ever solicit funds for research just for knowledge sake one?
Yeah, sure. If you go look at, so when you say we, Martin, this is kind of a tricky question. The laboratories that we're involved in managing, for example, Oak Ridge and Brookhaven, that's one of their principal roles in life. They're out there soliciting funds for nothing. And when I put that chart up, we talked about characterization and function, and then, characterization, structure, function, and then device and application. Most of the work that's going on right now and that I put into that characterization and structure category is very fundamental science as well. And
what about Battelle Columbus alone?
Battelle Columbus principally has not gotten engaged in that. And I don't see us doing that. It takes incredible investments in facilities. It takes a certain mindset and an approach to fundamental science that has not been the Battelle Columbus way of doing things generally. That's why there's a nice complementarity between a tendency toward a more applied view in Battelle Columbus, if you want to think about it that way. And although Oak Ridge, for example, has got a lot of applied orientation to it, certainly a big part of it is very fundamental science oriented. You know, if Jim Roberto were sitting here or something, he would talk about fundamental science work that he's doing for BES right now that is central to his strategy. Wouldn't you agree? Yes.
Yes.
Besides running the labs, looks like your model basically has 3 things in it. Optoelectronic materials and advanced materials. Looking at what happened to Xerox and Corning, advanced materials has been around for a long time.
Sure has.
What gives you a level of confidence that this is going to work?
Well, that's a great question. To compare us to Xerox and Corning is a bit tough. I mean, those are principally commercial firms delivering commercial products into the marketplace, with the vagaries and ups and downs associated with that.
Chris, the audience probably doesn't know the relationship between Xerox and Battelle.
Oh, yeah, that's probably true.
Why don't you tell them about that?
One of the reasons why Battelle is around is a guy by the name of Chester Carlson came to Battelle in the, I think it was early 50s, 50, 51, something like that. And said, I've got this, he called it I believe a dry paper copying device. And he'd been shopping it around to a number of different places, and none of them were interested in it. And he brought this to Battelle, and Battelle took an interest in it and started investing a lot of our money into expanding the patent portfolio and building taking it from a prototype into a first-generation product. Quite a bit of effort went into that. In fact, there's still one guy in particular around Battelle today that was involved actually in that project in the early mid-50s. That technology moved forward, and Battelle, working with this guy, Chester Carlson, was involved in setting up a company called Howloid Corporation, which took this technology out into the market, this dry paper copying technology. And when they brought this sort of monstrosity piece of equipment, yay big and everything, to the marketplace, folks at that particular time looked at it and said, are you kidding me? Why would I need this? And so Howloid, this wouldn't be Battelle's idea because we don't know marketing very well, at least from the commercial side. Howloid's idea was, and I think of this in that time frame because this was a very innovative idea, we will give you the equipment, you pay us a certain amount of money anytime you use this dry paper copying technology to make a copy of something. Immediately, overnight, became extremely successful. Howloid then turned over into a company that we now know as Xerox. And Battelle owned stock in Howloid, which became stock in Xerox. And Battelle made on that transaction, imagine in the 50s, $250 million. That was when $250 million was like a lot of money. And that funded a lot of Battelle investments over the next several years. So Battelle was intimately involved with Xerox and still feels a kinship with Xerox. Now to kind of go back to your question, what happened with Xerox and what happened with Corning is really, the Corning case, really a telecom marketplace and a variety of things went on there. Some similarities, some differences with Xerox. Battelle's fundamental business today is still research of one type or another, research and development of one type or another. Most of our revenue streams are based around that particular approach. We have a very different model than the Cornings and the Xerox do, in part because we're a not-for-profit organization. We have laboratories that we work with, as well as universities that are taking advantage of this government funding to do the very basic science that we can take advantage of. There's great interest in being able to put Battelle money in it, further develop it, and then take those products to the marketplace in one form or another, both government and commercial. If you go into the Xerox world, or Corning, that early phase work, they're either funding themselves in many ways or trying to figure out how to get access to it from others when they don't have some of the same views that we do. So very different revenue stream that we have as a source, the ability to access and leverage government-funded, pretty fundamental R&D would be at least two of the principal things that I would mention as the difference between a Battelle and a Xerox and a Corning. Hopefully that's at least a start. There's a lot of other answers I could give to that I think are relevant. You may notice that I was talking with Martin and Carl about this over lunch, that Battelle's history has been materials. Battelle in the 60s and 70s was known as one of the greatest source materials research. Now, this is the Battelle Columbus labs at that time. High-temperature alloy research, turbine blades for jet engines, a variety of different things that were going on at that point in time. Now, all of that disappeared in the late 70s and 80s when a lot of those businesses that were supporting contract research at Battelle took that research and pulled it inside. They said, this is too central for us to let someone else do it. We're going to hold that inside. So actually, Battelle has a long history of materials. It's moved, our center of gravity, though, has moved in many ways from the high-temperature side to the more soft materials, which I think is very central to this molecular design topic that I talked about today. Thank you for the question.
Right.
In addition to the particular technologies you mentioned, you said that there was an underpinning of computational science needs on these teams.
Right.
Could you elaborate more on that? Because we have computational science expertise that might not, maybe not particular science expertise in some areas.
All the labs are building and are vying for positions in the computational science world. It's one of the biggest sources of conflicts among the national labs. You may know that Oak Ridge is among the non-weapons national laboratories, generally recognized as, if not the leader, one of the leaders. Berkeley would be the other one that gets involved with this. And that resource that's being built at Oak Ridge, Thomas Zachariah has got a leading role in doing this, really we see as one of the central pieces to a strategy that goes far beyond Oak Ridge. We see a lot of folks in Columbus taking advantage of that, some of the other national laboratories taking advantage of that, to be able to model new material designs in the examples that I'm using, test out some of the fundamental properties and principles at a computational scale, and then move those into the experimental phase much earlier, hopefully with a much higher rate of success. So the principle that I'm talking about here is one where those teraflops allow you to do things that just, even 5 years ago, you wouldn't have even thought about doing. And imagine 5 years from today what you're going to be able to do. So that's the principle. Now, was there something more that you had in mind, or?
Well, no. I was particularly interested in whether you were talking about the ASCII type world.
No, this is the non-ASCII world, basically. Now, we're staying away from the liver. I shouldn't say that. The weapons world is a very different world. Access to the ASCII machines for some of the purposes that we're talking about is very difficult to get, even if you wanted it, and it's debatable if you'd want it. The Earth simulator, which Japan has put together, has really formed a fundamental challenge. Ray Orbach believes, who's the head of the Office of Science at DOE, and he's turning, in principle, at least one of the places, to Oak Ridge to meet that challenge. And we think that's a good opportunity for us to take advantage of that.
Kelsey.
Let me take you back a strange direction to the pharmaceutical stuff that you mentioned.
Yep.
I spent last week in Washington with one of what's a series of workshops. FDA has recognized that their industry is 50 years behind in the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. They're near the forefront in the development of them. And they are attempting to encourage the modernization of that. And part of that would probably be through what my center calls pre-competitive research. That is where you get companies together with vendors and researchers at universities and national labs and try to develop topics that they can agree on and would love to see commercialized, and they don't really view it as giving a competitive advantage to one company or another. It just raises the whole groups together.
Right.
Is that a mission that you view as fitting in the TEL role, either through the labs or through Columbus itself?
It is in the context of specific kinds of areas of science and technology that can fundamentally change a process. And I mean, an obvious and interesting example is if proteomics allows you to understand and develop kind of designer drugs for your body and based on your needs and your DNA, and that allows the FDA process to go from this monstrosity to a much more simplified approach. That would be the kind of thing that I can see us playing a collaborative, coordinating role in bringing that understanding and helping deliver it into some kind of a standard-setting body, FDA or whatever form it would take, to make the process more streamlined. Just as a regulatory process in and of itself, with absent science and technology, probably not.
Science and technology in this context is to just basically overhaul the whole way that pharmaceuticals are made once they're developed. They are using 50-year-old technology that it's easy to get approved because it's very familiar, but it is terrifically inefficient.
Well, I'd probably have to learn more about it to answer the question better, Kelsey. I mean, it could be, but I'd have to know more to be able to answer the question better.
Okay. I'll give June. He's never asked a question before. June, ask the question.
It looks to me Spacero is a kind of technology incubator, but of course, you have expertise much deeper than an incubator. My question is, how do you judge the business value? How can you get the insights of the business value of the technology?
I'm not sure I got that. How do we...
Insight. He wants to know, how do you make a judgment on the value of the technology?
On the value of the technology. Is that correct? Did he get that?
Insight.
Thank you. Sorry.
I speak wonderful Chinese.
Well, I don't think he was speaking Chinese. When we look at the technology, and when we try to figure out its value in the commercial marketplace in particular, I'll just focus on commercial for a second because we take it to both government and commercial. That ability to figure out its value is one of the most difficult things to do. I mean, it really is tough. And what we generally do is we go outside to people and bring in people that have had years and years of experience working in a particular market space and looking at a variety of technologies and asking their opinion. And then we get them involved in the process and we'll ultimately come out on a decision on its value. If I understand your question, it's a very good question. It is more art than science. And you can do all kinds of data, you can do market analysis, you can do competitive assessments, which we do all those things, but it still ultimately comes down to a very difficult judgment, especially when you're dealing with our kind of technology, which is not incremental developments, right? We're not involved in helping Intel move from 286 to 386 to 486 and that whole thing. We don't, they know that world, not us. We're involved in more radical innovations like optical switching. Lots of different folks working on it. Now, how do you decide that our approach to it could win in the marketplace? And let me add to that. Most times, the best technology doesn't win in the marketplace. It loses. Windows is a classic. My favorite example is, why did IBM pick Intel for a microprocessor, for God's sake? Motorola had the best processor. They still do, many would argue. There are Mac lovers here, I'm sure. And so there's example after example where the best technology doesn't win in the marketplace. So you have just asked a mouthful of a question, and I can only just begin to describe how we think about that going forward.
Okay. I'm sure I know there are a few more questions, but we can do the questions downstairs. I do see it seems like we have new faces every week, and these visitors don't know that after our colloquium presentations, we go downstairs and have refreshments, and everyone is invited. But before we do that, let's express our appreciation.
First time we got to see it in person this year.
Oh, yeah?